ever-evolving soap opera that is, of course, what's happening over at Royal Lodge.
Buckingham Palace says that King Charles has started the process to strip Prince Andrew of his title.
The affairs of the royal family tells you that we are living in quite bizarre times.
40 women, 4 days, 1 5-star hotel suite in Bangkok, and every single pound sterling paid for by British taxpayers who had no idea their money was funding what might be the most disgraceful episode of royal misconduct in modern history. This wasn't diplomacy. This wasn't trade negotiation. This was systematic exploitation, disguised as official business, and the documentation proving exactly what happened is currently locked away in government archives that should have been made public years ago, according to royal historian Andrew Lowney, who spent years investigating the former Duke of York's overseas activities. What transpired during that taxpayer-funded trip to Thailand represents only the visible tip of a much darker pattern of behavior that the monarchy enabled, protected, and deliberately concealed for decades. And now that the walls are finally closing in on Andrew Mountbatten Windsor, the question isn't just how he fell this far, it's what else is still being hidden behind those sealed palace files, and who knew exactly what was happening while British citizens unknowingly funded his international indulgences. Once celebrated as Queen Elizabeth's favourite son, Prince Andrew's reputation has imploded so completely that implosion barely describes the totality of his disgrace. His royal duties have been systematically stripped away, his military honours erased from official records, and even Royal Lodge, the sprawling 30-room Windsor estate he's desperately clinging to, now hangs precariously in the balance as King Charles applies increasing pressure to force him out. But according to historian Andrew Lowney's explosive research, this story of corruption and entitlement stretches back decades to when Andrew was first appointed as the United Kingdom's official trade envoy in 2001. He was 41 years old at the time, extraordinarily wealthy through inheritance and marriage settlements, utterly privileged by birth, and according to Lowney's assessment, experiencing what could only be described as a catastrophic midlife crisis. Instead of dedicating himself to genuine public service and advancing British commercial interests abroad, the former prince allegedly viewed his official position as nothing more than a diplomatic passport to unlimited excess. The role gave him access, credibility, and most importantly, taxpayer funding for international travel with minimal oversight. And he apparently exploited every single advantage that position offered. The most startling allegations center on an official visit to Thailand, where Andrew attended birthday celebrations for the Thai king. This was supposedly a diplomatic mission, fully funded by British taxpayers through government budgets allocated for trade promotion and international relations. But according to Lowney's investigation, Andrew immediately demanded to stay at a lavish 5-star hotel rather than using the British embassy facilities that would have been appropriate and far less expensive. He then added extensive private time to his official schedule, extending what should have been a brief diplomatic appearance into 2 full weeks of personal activities. This pattern of extending official trips with private diversions apparently characterized nearly every overseas journey he made during his decade as trade envoy. Then comes the detail that transforms this from bureaucratic excess into genuine scandal. Lowney claims that during Andrew's stay at that luxury Bangkok hotel, 40 women were paid to visit his suite over just 4 days. The historian emphasizes this information has been verified through multiple independent sources, including a Reuters correspondent stationed in Thailand, and even a member of the Thai royal family who had knowledge of the arrangements. This wasn't rumor or speculation. This was documented behavior, witnessed by people in positions to know exactly what was happening. According to Lowney's research, Andrew operated without moral boundaries during this period. His sense of entitlement was absolute and unshakable. He allegedly used his trade envoy role not to advance Britain's economic interests, but exclusively for his own pleasure and profit. While conducting government business trips, he systematically mixed questionable commercial deals with personal pursuits, all carefully concealed under the legitimate-sounding guise of official diplomacy. The taxpayers funding these excursions had no idea their money was subsidizing anything beyond standard diplomatic activity. What makes this historical pattern even more significant is that Andrew's own brother apparently predicted exactly this outcome. Charles, who was then Prince of Wales, had reportedly warned against giving Andrew the trade envoy role in the first place. His reasoning was blunt and prophetic. Andrew would just chase women and play golf instead of actually working. And based on what we now know about how Andrew conducted himself during that decade of official overseas representation, Charles's assessment appears to have been completely accurate. Perhaps the most disturbing element of Loney's findings is that Andrew's behavior was systematically enabled by diplomats, personal aides, and royal staff members who were either too afraid of his volcanic temper or too bound by institutional loyalty to intervene or report what they witnessed. Andrew was notorious among palace circles for his rage, his impossible demands, and his absolute refusal to accept the word no from anyone, regardless of their position or the reasonableness of their objections. Those who worked directly under him during his trade envoy years describe a man who viewed public office as personal entitlement, someone who deliberately blurred every possible line between legitimate public service and naked self-interest. Behind closed doors and far from public scrutiny, he allegedly exploited every advantage and privilege that came with his royal title. But the scandal extends far beyond private excess and sexual misconduct. According to Loney's investigation, Andrew actively used his trade envoy position to advance the financial interests of himself and his close associates. One businessman named David Rollins reportedly benefited enormously from Andrew's access to international power brokers, securing critical business meetings, and even obtaining a Middle Eastern banking license thanks to Andrew's direct interventions and introductions. The documents detailing these trips, these meetings, and these business arrangements are still locked away in government archives under classifications that prevent public access. Loney characterizes this as a deliberate conspiracy of silence. Files that should have been declassified and released years ago, but remain sealed. And the longer they stay hidden from public view, the louder the questions become about what exactly those documents would reveal. The Thailand trip wasn't an isolated incident of misconduct. During Andrew's taxpayer-funded visit to Hong Kong in 2010, multiple staff members reported watching a steady stream of paid escorts being brought directly to his hotel suite on the top floor of a luxury property. While technically the activity itself might be legal under Hong Kong law, anything involving organized procurement absolutely is not, which makes these claims particularly explosive given Andrew's official status, the extremely public nature of his visit, and the undeniable fact that British taxpayers were covering substantial portions of the bill for his accommodation and security. Official court records confirm Andrew maintained a brutally packed schedule during that Hong Kong trip, rushing between business meetings, bank visits, and high society dinners across Hong Kong and mainland China in the weeks surrounding the alleged incident. Yet behind that veneer of legitimate diplomatic activity, according to aides who've been interviewed for documentaries and books examining his tenure, his private behavior was an open secret among those with access to his inner circle. Staff members knew exactly what was happening but felt powerless to report it or prevent it. What makes these accusations even more damaging is recognizing they're not isolated events, but rather pieces of a broader behavioral pattern. Former palace staffers have described for years a revolving door of women visiting Andrew's rooms during overseas trips, and Loney's research paints a portrait of someone driven by compulsive habits rather than any genuine diplomatic focus or concern for Britain's commercial interests. The financial dimension only deepens the scrutiny. Investigators who've analysed Andrew's travel records estimate that his flights and accommodation during the decade he spent representing the United Kingdom abroad cost approximately £4 million, with individual trips sometimes exceeding £90,000 in travel expenses alone. Set against that backdrop of extraordinary public expense, claims about his questionable relationships with well-connected figures in China and other countries paint a deeply troubling portrait of a senior royal systematically treating official overseas missions as personal playgrounds, while the British public picked up every bill without knowledge of what they were actually funding. For years, the palace attempted damage control through quiet warnings, brief suspensions from certain activities, and half-hearted efforts to keep Andrew away from media spotlight. But everything changed when King Charles ascended to the throne. The new king has taken decisive action that his mother either couldn't or wouldn't take, formally stripping Andrew of his remaining royal honors and officially notifying him to vacate Royal Lodge and relocate to far more modest accommodations. Current sources close to the palace report that Andrew is desperately clinging to whatever fragments remain of his former status. He remains defiant, stubbornly refusing to accept that the monarchy has permanently moved on without him and will never welcome him back regardless of how much time passes. He reportedly spends his days in isolation at Royal Lodge, detached from reality and increasingly bitter about his circumstances. One palace insider claimed Andrew has been essentially holed up playing video games throughout the day, having become a recluse within his own sprawling estate. Friends who still maintain contact describe him as consumed by bitterness, systematically blaming everyone else for his downfall while accepting zero personal responsibility for the choices that destroyed his reputation. But with King Charles's patience completely exhausted after decades of embarrassment and scandal, Andrew's era of special protection and preferential treatment has definitively ended. There will be no quiet diplomatic solutions, no more institutional cover-ups, no more special consideration because of his birth or his relationship to the monarch. This is the story of a man whose arrogance and overwhelming sense of entitlement finally consumed him completely. Yet perhaps the most chilling aspect of this entire saga isn't the scandalous behavior itself. It's the institutional silence that protected it for so long. Because according to Loney's findings, Andrew's conduct didn't happen in isolation or without knowledge. It was part of a much wider culture of indulgence, secrecy, and unchecked privilege that nobody within the system dared to question or expose palace staff knew. Diplomats knew. Government officials who approved his travel budgets must have had some awareness of the discrepancies between official schedules and actual activities. But the machinery of protection around senior royals was so powerful that accountability never arrived during the years when it might have prevented further misconduct. Former staff members have shared stories about the bizarre extent of Andrew's demands and his childlike need for everything to be exactly as he wanted. There are accounts of him maintaining a collection of approximately 40 teddy bears that had to be assembled and arranged perfectly on his bed, according to a specific chart that staff were required to follow. While that detail might seem quirky or harmless, it speaks to a deeper pattern of someone who expected absolute compliance with his preferences, no matter how absurd or demanding they became. Staff members report that particularly in recent years since his effective exile from royal duties, Andrew has taken his isolation and frustration out on the people around him, creating a toxic environment for anyone unfortunate enough to work in his household. There may well be additional bombshells waiting to surface in the near future. Government files eventually must be declassified. More people who witnessed his behavior during those years may choose to speak publicly now that he no longer wields power or protection. And if the monarchy genuinely wants to survive this era of unprecedented scrutiny and declining public support, it must demonstrate conclusively that even its most privileged members are not above accountability or legal consequences for their actions. Andrew's story has nothing to do anymore with royal romance, meaningful public service, or ceremonial duty. This is fundamentally about a man who believed rules and normal standards of conduct simply didn't apply to someone of his status, and about an institutional system that allowed him to maintain that belief far too long. He once represented Britain on the global stage as an official trade envoy, meeting with foreign leaders and influential business figures while carrying the prestige of the British crown. Now he represents everything the monarchy must definitively leave behind if it has any hope of surviving into future generations with public legitimacy intact. The title is gone, stripped away formally and permanently. The grand home is next, with King Charles applying steady pressure to force relocation to something far less prestigious, and the respect he once commanded through fear and status. That was already completely lost years ago. This isn't a temporary royal setback or a scandal that will eventually fade from memory. This is the complete and irreversible dismantling of a legacy, the transformation of someone who was born into extraordinary privilege, into a cautionary tale about what happens when entitlement goes unchecked and institutions prioritize protection over accountability. The conspiracy of silence that shielded him for decades has finally shattered, and what's been revealed behind that protective wall is far uglier than most people imagined. That's it for today, folks. See you in the next video.